Okay, so that's that. Today we'll be focusing on Basel IV. Quick catch up or quick recap on what we have discussed so far. We looked at Basel II entirely, and we spent quite a lot of time in how we actually do use standardized approach and internal rating based approach to derive our RWA for capital composition or for derivation of 8% capital requirement. We looked at the changes introduced by Basel III, and we discussed the changes introduced under capital composition. So the capital compositions was a little bit changed because of the issues or because of the 2008 financial crisis when Basel III was introduced in 2010. They made changes to the composition of capital under credit risk, and we looked at that in details. And we also looked at liquidity risk, where we look at how LCR, liquidity coverage ratio, is actually derived, and NSFR, net stable funding. And we also look at leverage percentage, how we calculate leverage. Okay, so we looked at all that under Basel III, and today we'll be looking at Basel IV. Basel IV was introduced in December 2007. And the focus of Basel IV was to ensure that there's disparity in terms of the way the various banks calculate their RWA. The focus of Basel IV was also on credit risk because, as we mentioned in class, in our previous classes, that majority of the risk portfolio of banks, 75% of it is mainly around credit risk. So Basel regulation has always been focused on credit risk. And that's why it was one of the major reasons they introduced these Basel III reforms, also known as Basel IV, in 2017. And the focus is on the RWA calculation. If you remember, Basel II, we focused more on RWA calculations. In Basel III, the focus was on capital composition and liquidity risk. Now in Basel IV, there is so much variations in the way banks actually calculate their RWA. There is so much disparity. It's difficult to pick up the RWA of a bank, which is the risk-weighted asset of the bank, a measure of how risky it is to lend to a particular customer. Pick it up for one bank and compare it to another bank. There is so much variation in it. Some banks are using internal rating-based approach, while some other banks are using standardized approach. So there is variety in the application or the approach being used to calculate RWA. And this is part of what Basel IV wants to correct. We want to be able to compare like for like the RWA of banks. If I pick up Bank A's RWA, I want to believe they are using the same approach to calculate the RWA compared to Bank B. Okay, so that I can measure how risky it is to actually invest in that bank or to buy the shares in that, or to assess the profitability of a particular bank. Okay, so that's the aim of Basel IV, to ensure that banks RWA or risk portfolio can actually be compared like for like across all the banks in the whole world. Okay, so that's what we'll be looking at extensively. There is also capital flooring that was introduced as part of Basel IV. But capital flooring has to do with the amount of capital savings banks can make, or RWA savings that bank can make using internal rating-based approach. There is introduction of CVA as well. We'll see the changes to its CVA, which is credit valuation. And we'll also look at the operational risk aspect. There's changes to operational risk as well compared to what we have under Basel II. There was no change to operational risk under Basel III, but they have made changes to the way we calculate capital charge for operational risk. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, market risk is covered under another module, FRTB, so we'll not be looking at that in detail. Okay, that's just the basic overview of what Basel IV is all about. Most banks have not started implementing Basel IV, sorry. The implementation was meant to start in 2022, but because of COVID-19 or because of the pandemic, they have moved the implementation date by 1 year. So implementation of Basel IV will now start in January 2023 instead of 2022. as initially stated by the Basel Committee. So a lot of banks have started putting resources together. They've started sourcing for data for the implementation of Basel IV. So I think it's the right time. This is the right time to, if you want to, go into that aspect or into that area of career-wise, or maybe you want to actually focus on risk management from Basel regulation perspective, I think this is the best time to go in, get your CV ready, and after this class, I'm sure you will have enough knowledge to be able to actually work on Basel IV implementation as a project manager or business analyst or a test analyst or implementation analyst. Okay, so that's the basic overview of Basel III reforms or Basel IV. Before we go into the slides in details, does anyone have any question?
No, Mike, I'm good.
Okay, thanks, Ruthie. So let's look at what are the key changes. Now, remember under Basel II, we looked at the calculation of RWA in detail. Our focus on Basel IV is to look at the changes, okay, between what the newly introduced changes under Basel IV. We will not be going into details of all the calculations that we did under Basel II, but we'll just look at the changes introduced in Basel IV. Okay, we lay the foundation under Basel II and Basel III. Now let's look at the newly introduced changes, and based on that, we assess what the impact will be on the RWA calculations. Okay, so Basel III reform 2017 reform is also known as Basel IV. So some people call it Basel III reforms. Some people call it Basel IV. It's the same thing. Let's look at the introduction or the overview of the 2017 Basel III reforms. The Basel Committee the Basel Committee's reform complement the initial phase of the Basel III reforms announced in 2010. That's the main Basel III requirement or framework. It came into being in 2010 as a result of the financial crisis. So if you remember, the committee didn't emphasize that most of the banks that went down or that went under during the 2008 financial crisis, they could experience the financial crisis, but they realized that they have enough capital, and at the same time they still went under. So that's one of the reasons why they introduced the Basel III. But as a result of Basel III, it did not actually cover the areas of RWA calculations. Just Basel III only focused on capital composition. So this Basel III reforms complement, the 2010 Basel III requirements. The 2017 reform seeks to restore credibility. That's the idea. Want to restore credibility because, as I said earlier on, the majority of the financial institutions during the 2008 financial crisis actually met the capital requirement, okay, but they still went under. They still had these issues, and some majority of them had to be built out by the government. So that means that there is no credibility in a way. Because if you say you are meeting the requirement, you are meeting the capital requirement, and you still went under, then there's a little bit of doubt in the way the Basel Committee actually puts the regulations out there to calculate the capital composition or capital requirement of the bank. So in order to restore this credibility, okay, in the calculation of RWA to improve the comparability of banks' capital ratios. I actually mentioned earlier on that there is no basis, for comparing the capital ratios of different financial institutions. Okay, if as a bank I am using standardized approach, and as another bank, so a bank B is using internal rating based approach for all their exposures, then there is no way we can compare the two because two different banks are using two different approaches. That means that there is no basis for comparing the RWAs, or how risky it is for the bank to hold such assets in their balance sheet. Okay, so that's what one of the key things that the 2017 Basel III reforms wants to address. We want to have a basis for comparing, the RWA and the capital ratios of different banks. Okay, why are the 2017 reforms necessary? Credibility of the framework. Okay, a range of studies found are non-acceptable wide variations across banks in RWA calculations. I've discussed that, so let's leave that. The unwarranted variation makes it difficult to compare capital ratios. You cannot compare the capital ratios because of the variations in the way banks calculate their RWA. And as a result, it undermines the confidence in the capital ratios that banks actually put together or report to their regulators or their investors. Okay, the reforms will help us address and help restore the credibility of risk-based capital ratios. So that's what Basel IV is mainly about. We want to have faith in the RWA calculations that banks are sending to regulators. Because if you cannot rely on these RWA calculations, then there's a problem. We cannot make any meaningful decision on how healthy it is to invest in a particular bank, okay, or whether the bank will even be able to continue to run as a going concern. Okay, so these are the things that the Basel III 2017 reforms actually wants to address. Basel III 2017 reform, let's look at the overview. Internal rating model. The reform introduced constraints on the estimate banks can make when they use their internal models. There is going to be a constraint going forward on the amount of capital savings that you can make using internal rating based approach. Okay, remember, internal rating based approach, banks use their own internal estimates of their risk models or RWA to derive their RWA. They use their own internally derived risk estimates. Okay, the probability of default, the LGD, the maturity, they are all internally derived, using their own developed internal rating models to estimate these risk measures or so to estimate these risk components that are used to derive their risk weight. So there is a constraint that has been introduced. There is a limit to the amount of capital savings that a bank can make using internal rating models going forward. Okay, under Basel II, there was nothing like that. Okay, you can just, as long as you apply the scaling factor of 1.06 to your RWA, that's it. But going forward, there are some exposures that there's a limit to the amount of savings that you can make as a financial institution using internal rating models. In other words, the regulators are trying to discourage financial institutions from using internal rating based. There is a cap to the amount of savings that you can make using internal rating based model. Okay, and in some cases, remove the use of internal rating models for calculation of RWA for some exposure classes. Okay, so entirely now, for instance, we will cover it later on. Going forward, exposures to institutions will not be reported under advanced approach. Okay, you can see that's a big change. Before, under Basel II, institutions can be reported under what? Under advanced approach, under advanced internal rating based approach. But as a result of Basel IV and as a result of the extensive work that has been done, by the Basel Committee to actually identify the key exposure classes that needs to be moved away from advanced approach to either foundation approach or standardized approach. They have highlighted institutions, exposures to institutions as one of the key exposure classes that should no longer be reported under advanced approach. Okay, so while the first phase of Basel III focused largely on the capital side of the capital ratio calculation, remember, under Basel III, our focus is on capital composition. If you remember, we spoke about the change under tier 2, we have tier 1 and tier 2 capital, and tier 1 is made up of 4% and tier 2 is made of 4%. But under Basel III, we introduce additional capital requirements, additional capital in terms of conservative buffer, capital buffer, and countercyclical capital buffer. Okay, 2.5%, 2.5%, and that increased our capital ratio. Okay, that the amount of capital that the banks needs to set aside, and additional capital for GSIBs as well, globally systemically important banks. So we discussed all that under Basel III, and if you remember, our focus was just on capital under Basel III, but the focus of Basel IV is on RWA calculation, which is the denominator. Okay, remember your risk-based capital ratio is equal to your regulatory capital divided by your RWA. What we are saying in essence is that this regulatory capital was focused, that's the focus of Basel III. Basel III focuses on the composition of capital, while Basel IV focuses on RWA. This is the focus of Basel IV. Okay, so everything we'll be discussing when you want to calculate the capital ratio of the bank, the focus of Basel IV is on RWA, which is the denominator. And we have discussed this under Basel III, so we are not touching this at all in Basel IV. Okay, so all the changes we'll be discussing today is around RWA, and that's the focus of Basel IV from the Basel Committee. Okay, so what's the implementation timeline for this Basel IV across the board? We have the credit risk revised standardized approach. The implementation date starts for 1st of January 2023. This was meant to be 2022, but because of the pandemic, because of the coronavirus pandemic, the Basel Committee has given the banks the opportunity to focus more on how they resolve the pandemic issue, and extended the implementation dates by 1 year. So initially it was meant to be 2022, but now the implementation starts on 1st of January 2023. Revised internal rating based is 1st of January 2023 as well. Revised credit valuation adjustment CVA 2023, operational risks 2023, market risk under FRTB 2023. Okay, and output flooring. Output flooring is the amount of capital that can be saved using internal rating based approach. They expect this to be phased in over a period of 6 years. Okay, you cannot implement it at once, so they want it to be phased in over a period of 6 years. First 50% should be achieved by 2023, 55% by 2024, 60% 2025, 2026 65%, 2027 by 70%, and the capital flooring of using internal rating based approach should finally be 72.5% by 2028. Okay, and as a result of this, all this implementation will be concurrently implemented, or will be implemented in parallel with the capital flooring as we progress into the years of implementation of the Basel IV requirement. Okay, the leverage ratio existing exposure definition by January 2018, which majority of the banks in Europe have actually implemented. I'm not sure how it's implemented outside Europe, but majority of banks, big banks in Europe, have implemented the leverage ratio as part of the Basel III requirement. Revised exposure definition by the new changes is expected to be implemented by 2022, now 2023. And the GSIB for buffers by 2023 as well. Okay, so that's the implementation timeline. You can see that banks generally, they've started, putting resources together, as I mentioned earlier on, trying to gather the necessary people that will be working on the changes. The business analysts have already started in some banks, while some banks are still looking to put the structure in place to implement these Basel regulations. Okay, so it's always a good time. This is the best time to actually get into that, area if you are interested in that field. Okay, so let's move on to Basel IV credit risk under standardized approach. What are the changes introduced to standardized approach under Basel IV for credit risk? Let's have an overview of what credit risk again. We all know already, but let's just quickly brush our memory and brush up our memory on what credit risk is all about. So what is credit risk? Credit risk is the risk of loss due to any borrower being unable to pay a debt in full or in part. I always say it's not until you are unable to pay in full. If you are unable to pay in part over 3 months, then you are in default already. If you are not able to make your payment over a 3-month period, then the exposure is in default, and that's the definition of credit risk. So any loss to the bank, as a result of a borrower not being able to meet their obligation or meet their repayment as at when due is credit risk, and it accounts for the bulk of most banks' risk-taking activities and regulatory capital requirement. It is after we have calculated RWA and capital charges for credit risk that we calculate for other for other risk as well. Okay, the first and the most important risk to the bank is the credit risk. Okay, there are two broad approaches to calculate RWA for credit risk. We know that already: standardized approach and internal rating-based approach. I will not dwell much on that. Let's move on. So what are the main changes under standardized approach for credit risk under Basel IV? Let's highlight the changes introduced by the Basel Committee to the calculation of RWA under standardized approach. First, the enhanced risk sensitivity while keeping the standardized approach for credit risk sufficiently simple. Okay, enhanced risk sensitivity while keeping the standardized approach for credit risk sufficiently simple. Okay, provide for more detailed risk weighting approach instead of flat risk weight. That's what we're trying to say in essence. Okay, so if you remember, for instance, under residential mortgage, under residential real estate or residential mortgage, we said for secured risk weight is 35%, and for secured risk weight is 35% for exposures with loan to value that is less than 80%. Okay, if the loan to value is less than 80%, then the secured risk weight is 35% if the exposure is to a borrower within an EEA region. But if it's non-EEA, it's 50%. You can see that it's just a flat. Once the loan to value is less than 80%, then what is it? Apply 35% if it's within the European Economic Area. And if it's above 80%, which means that you are contributing lower amounts to your mortgage, then you get to apply a particular, there's a formula that we apply, and you derive your RWA based on that. You derive your risk weight based on that. And what we're trying to say is that there is more granularity to the way we actually apply risk weight based on LTV. You are not using flat risk weight of 35% anymore. So it's more risk sensitive. Okay, the way we apply risk weight is more risk sensitive than just applying a flat rate based on whether loan to value is 80%, is greater than 80% or less than 80%. We now, under Basel IV, we have is loan to value greater than 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%. Based on this range, we apply different risk weight. So that's what we meant. That's what it's meant in my slide as enhanced risk sensitivity. Okay, for exposures to bank as well. Remember, unrated bank, we apply what? 100%. This is no longer the case. For unrated bank, we apply, there is a different set of risk weights that needs to be applied for unrated banks, exposures to unrated banks under Basel IV compared to Basel II. Okay, so the Basel IV is more risk sensitive when it's compared to the way we actually risk weight exposures, exposures to banks and other exposure classes under Basel II. Okay, so we'll look at that in details and see where the changes has occurred. Reduce reliance on external credit ratings. Okay, so banks going forward are required to conduct or carry out due diligence on their customers or their obligors or counterparties. Okay, so going forward, you are not going to, as a financial institution, for some exposure classes, the financial institutions are not expected to actually fully rely on the ratings obtained from the external credit rating agencies. Okay, should not, banks should not going forward rely on the estimate of ratings or ratings received or obtained from the external rating agencies. For each counterparty, banks are expected to carry out what we call due diligence, okay, in a way of using their own information about their customer to estimate whether the customer should have a higher risk weight or lower risk weight. Sorry, whether it should have a higher rating or lower rating compared to what is obtained from the external rating agencies, the Fitch, S&P, and Moody's. Remember, under Basel II, for standardized approach, what we do is just to obtain the external ratings of these customers and apply risk weight using the CQS table that is given to us by the regulators, the credit quality step that maps the external ratings of the customers to the risk weight given to us by the regulators. But what we are saying is that going forward, as part of Basel IV, banks should carry out due diligence, and the essence of doing this is to ensure that we are giving the right ratings, okay, to the customers. So we are not fully relying on the external ratings obtained from the rating agencies. We need to carry out our own due diligence using the information we have about the customers to see whether the customer should actually attract a lower rating or not. Okay. Also, have a sufficiently detailed non-rating based approach for jurisdictions that cannot or do not wish to rely on external credit ratings. Okay, for jurisdictions that do not have access to external ratings of their customers, we are looking to actually find a way to actually risk weight them. So we are providing unrated ratings, okay, for non-rating for banks that operate in a country that do not have access to ratings of their customers. Okay, so these are the two main changes for standardized approach. Okay, so let's look at the changes in details. First of all, it's not all the exposure classes that are impacted. Before we move on, do you guys have any question, please?
No questions, Mike.
No question. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so let's look at each of these exposure class and see where we have changes, and when we don't have changes, we will just move on quickly from there. Okay, exposures to sovereigns. You remember we discussed this under Basel II. Treatment is unchanged from Basel II. Okay, there is no change to the way we risk weight exposures to sovereigns under Basel IV. Okay, it's the same as we obtained under Basel II. So for AAA to A minus, continue to be 0%, 20% for A plus to A minus, and for unrated sovereigns or central government or central banks, it will continue to be 100%. If you remember, under Basel II, we also said that we can use the external export credit agency risk scores can also be used for the purpose of risk weighting exposures to sovereign. If the ECA risk score is 0 to 1, then the risk weight will be 0. If it's 3, it will be 50%. If the ECA risk score is 5, then the risk weight will be 100%, and if it's 7, it's going to be 150%. Okay, so there's no change to the way we risk weight